The best place to hide the truth is in the pages of a book.
Maybe we should just read. Maybe we should just read.
Welcome to Hayes Reviews. Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is Nick, creator of Hayes Reviews. We're back today, July the 4th, 2026, for another live stream, live reading, continuing our series on foundations, their power and influence. It's good to be back. I've had quite a bit of time off from live streaming due to having to manage things like fatherhood and a job and life in general. So it's looking more likely that earlier mornings will be better for me in terms of getting these live streams done. So keep an eye out on the Telegram group for those announcements when I'm going live. As always, the replays will be posted after the fact, so you can catch up if you're unable to check in on the actual day. But it's good to be back. I'm looking at my control panels. It looks like we are live on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. Odyssey looks like we're live, which is good, because the last few times I tried to stream there, it was crap. Nothing happened. It was stuttery. We were dropping and missing and losing frames all over the place. But from what I can tell, it's going out and it looks good. But say hello, please, if you're in the chats on any of those channels. Let me know if you are hearing me loud and clear. It's been a while since I did this, and so there could be a few teething problems as we get back into the flow. But yes, welcome back. I hope you're doing well. It's a momentous day, the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, or something like that. I'm not sure. I'm not American, even though some people think I sound like it. I'm actually English, which is much, much, much worse. But I don't think it was me or my ancestors that did any of that horrible stuff. As far as I'm aware, we were basically from the peasant class who, were just dominated and controlled throughout the many generations. I don't have that special blood coursing through my veins that gives me open doors to lucrative positions in gigantic corporations and organizations. And I think that's probably for the best, because my experience of working in gigantic corporations, it's not for me. It's really not for me. I struggle to understand it. There's a lot of weird stuff going on, a lot of shenanigans. People talk a lot without really saying anything. And people show up and do work, and nothing seems to really get done. So it's kind of an odd environment. I'm sure it's just me not quite understanding the way it's supposed to work or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, that's not what we're here for. We're here today to continue with our book. We are only about halfway through the book, and this is part 7 in the series. And I want to crack on. I want to make some more progress because it's a fascinating book. It's very interesting. We are learning a lot, and it's giving us an insight into a kind of, I wouldn't say a hidden mechanism of power, but it's a mechanism of power that I think doesn't get a lot of limelight. When we see our tabloid press and our headline news media outlets drumming up all the rage and the fear and the anxiety and the angst in the population, they don't tend to point at philanthropic organizations and charities and NGOs and these kinds of things. Those sorts of organizations typically get a pass. They might get some favorable coverage in the press as having done something fantastic or beneficial or benevolent, but they don't come under a lot of scrutiny And they should, because as we're learning in this book, since the early 20th century, these organizations have been viewed by some discerning and observing members of society as fundamentally being unaccountable, well-funded manipulators and shapers of society. These organizations, these foundations, are gifted vast, enormous sums of money, basically to do whatever they want to do, only it's not to do whatever they want to do, because of course if you control the purse and the purse strings, then you get to dictate what the receivers of your money have to do. Otherwise, you close the purse and you don't give them any money. It's really that simple. And so if you want to reinvent a culture, or if you want to subvert or change the direction of a particular culture, then you do it by funding scientists and researchers and authors and speakers and groups and organizations and investigations and all this kind of stuff. You fund it, you sort of hint or define the outcome that you want them to arrive at first, right? Or at least you tell them what you want them to investigate. And if anybody comes up with a conclusion that doesn't fit the outcome that you want, then no more funding for you, sir or madam, or whoever it is. And so that's what we're learning in this book. Is this has been going on over 100 years now. And Big C event we lived through, inordinate amounts of influence came from the likes of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And what's really interesting, in my recent appearance on James Corbett's Film Literature and the New World Order podcast, we discussed this little book here, which is my copy is a little book. I don't know if you can see that. You can't. Okay, we'll go to the book cam. That's what the book cam's for, isn't it, after all? So if we go to book cam, you can see here, this is Advancement of Learning and New Atlantis by Francis Bacon. This is a really small kind of pocketbook copy that I have. But if you go in, New Atlantis is literally like 40 pages long. I mean, granted, this is quite small writing, but it's only 40 pages long. But I talked to James Corbett about this, and there's so much in these 40 pages that tell you about the world and how it works and how a scientific elite can withhold techniques and methodologies and advancements and knowledge from the state. It says it in here that, we're the elite scientists and we're doing our experiments in caves, and we decide what we do and do not reveal to the state. But very interestingly, what it says in here, and it actually says this 3 times, is the House of Solomon, which is the name of this sort of college of scientists who rule from the caves and are venerated as the sort of wisest, most valuable members in this society called Ben Salem. This group, this house, this Solomon's house, it's referred to as a foundation 3 times, in fact, throughout the text. Is that a coincidence? Probably. It's probably just a coincidence that back in the 1600s, this shadowy group of unaccountable, well-funded, knowledgeable elite, if you want to call them that, were referred to as a foundation. And of course, now that I've said that, I'm struggling to find the page. To give you an example, because I don't want you to believe me. I don't want you to just say, oh, well, Nick said it, therefore it must be true. I want you to be skeptical. I want you to be incredulous and to say, well, no, show me the receipts, Nick. Show me the actual page where it uses the word foundation. And there, I found it. I witted on long enough so I could actually find an example. So that's just one example there. He's talking about the title of this foundation. It also is known as the College of the 6 Days Works. And then a little later, it actually gives the goal, the overarching mission of the foundation, which is also worth mentioning. It's right here, and it's a great quote, and it uses the word foundation as well. So this is the end, right? If you think about this word, the end, the goal, the plan, the outcome. This is what we're aiming towards. This is what we're working towards. There's also a book by Huxley here, which is called Ends and Means. And you can see that. It's not very clear, is it? Ends and Means by Aldous Huxley. So the idea is the ends justify the means. Right? You can commit atrocities and murder and lies and deceit and torture and abuse and genocide and all that stuff if your intentions are good and it's for the betterment of humanity. You got to be thinking in terms of he was a bad guy in the Marvel superhero films. He had a big glove and he put some multicolored rainbow stones in it and he clicked it, and then half of the living beings in the universe were instantly killed. And this, in his twisted logic, was because there's too many people, there's too many living things in the universe, and I've seen what happens when there's too many living things and they're allowed to reproduce unchecked. It's chaos, it's terrible, it's awful. So if we cull the population, if we reduce it down to, say, maybe, 500 million in accordance with the Georgia Guidestones, then that's a better number. It's more manageable, easier to manage for the managerial class, and that's a good thing, right? So ends and means, the ends justify the means. This word end is very important. And here in New Atlantids, in my copy, it's page 288, we are told by a fellow, by a father, by a priest, by a member of this Solomon's house, the foundation of Ben Salem. He says, the end of our foundation is the knowledge of causes and secret motions of things, and the enlarging of the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible. It sounds a little bit like Cecil Rhodes, his last will and testament. It sounds a little bit like, let's spread this empire. It's a great thing what we're doing here. Let's send it out to as many people as possible, right? So enlarging the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible. And then, of course, that makes you think of hubris. It makes you think of the Tower of Babel, right? We're gonna expand human empire into the heavens, which also links in and reminds me of C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, right? That group in the space trilogy is more so in the third book, That Hideous Strength. It's also a foundation. It's a scientific foundation, and they also have this goal to spread to other planets and dominate other planets. And then what do you see in this day and age in actual 3D reality? We are told there is the world's first super trillionaire, Elon Musk. What an awesome rock star, Iron Man type, dark MAGA character he is. Isn't he cool? And he's going to take us all to Mars. Of course, also that narrative itself was seeded and foreshadowed in a book by Werner von Braun, who talked about a mission to Mars in one of his books, and this was presided over by a group of men, a kind of council who were called the Elon. So reality, far, far stranger than fiction. And then the places where reality and fiction sort of reflect and mirror each other, it gets really interesting. So welcome to the show. It's good to be back. I hope you are hearing me loud and clear if you're tuning in live. And if you're watching on the replay, I also hope you're hearing me loud and clear. As far as I can tell, we are broadcasting to all the places in all the right way. So without any further ado, let's get into tonight's preamble ramble. Yes, I do have a preamble ramble. I've got a couple of things to show you and some notes to read from. So I'll go from the notes first. And let's see if I can just set this up. As I said, it's been a while since I did it. Let's have a look. Nope, that wasn't what I wanted to do at all. So now I'm just grappling with LibreOffice. Got it, did it, managed it. All right, let's go over here. So what I did, I got my transcript from the previous video and I ran it through those horrible tools that that are mislabeled as AI, and there's nothing intelligent about them. It's just predictive. It's a very advanced predictive text. On your phone when it predicts the words that you're trying to write, it's a very advanced one of those. But it is handy for analyzing big, long transcripts or data sets, or to pull out patterns. So that's pretty good. So what I did, I ran through the transcript of my previous live stream and I said, all right, pull out the points of this, then we can recap them. And then I highlighted the things that I think are pertinent and worth revisiting. So in the last section of the book, which was it was all about education. It was all about textbooks and left-leaning ideology. It was called Foundations and Radicalism in Education. And the thesis of the chapter was about how foundations control education, the way in which this is done, and the way in which educational radicalism and leftist, socialist, Fabianism type ideology are injected into the schools by way of textbooks and authors who are funded and researchers who are funded. And of course, anyone who is arguing for, who's trying to get foundation grant money for the study of traditionalism, of conservatism, of Christianity, they don't get the funding, right? He told us in the book as well that some educational organizations actually ditched their religious affiliation because they knew that if they clung onto it, if they held onto it, they wouldn't get the foundation funding. Okay, so you had to become secular, you have to become non-denominational. In other words, that's another way that scientism is brought in. And actually, Rene uses the word scientism in this book, which surprised me because I thought it was a more recent term. But that was a whole chapter before this one, Social Science and Scientism. That was chapter 4, another very interesting section of the book. But let's just recap what we learned in the last section so that we can frame what we're going to be going into today. So what he said was that a powerful foundation complex developed to exercise major influence over American education. Now, this was back in 1958 when the book was published, so the studies and the investigations were done in the preceding decades. By this point, it's not just American education. By this point, it's education full stop. Basically, it's global education, and that ties in as well. And there's some writers and authors and books that we'll have a look at that tell us that. And even back, whatever this was, this will be 50, 60, 70 years ago. So he said that early foundation work improved higher education standards, but the method was coercive. So again, that's like, okay, we'll help you improve your standards, your methods, your methodology, maybe we'll give you some resources, improve the classrooms, that kind of thing. But there's always conditions. There's always conditions that come with the money that's doled out in the name of philanthropy and charity, right? Colleges and universities allegedly faced a practical bargain: accept foundation conditions or lose access to money. And the quote was, conform or no grant. And of course, if you are financially struggling as a college, you're not making that much money, teachers don't get paid that much, and professors, etc., then you're going to look to the people who have the money, which is the people who run the foundations. So there was this phrase as well: power uncontrolled by public responsibility, to describe the way in which this foundation, these philanthropic organizations, could influence schools, children, ideology, the minds, the culture of society, and yet they have no public responsibility, right? There's no accountability either. There's no way for the public to push back and say, stop doing this. So there was a committee, the Walsh Committee, and this is cited as hearing that colleges abandoned religious affiliations to meet foundation requirements. The school policymakers began anticipating foundation preferences, creating conformity without direct orders. So they know what the foundations are looking for. Of course, there's going to be a grapevine, there's going to be whispers and murmurs of these foundation administrators. This is what they're looking for. You've got a better chance of securing some grant money if you frame your study in this way, or if you pitch a particular project in a certain way. They know that information circulates, and this is like a self-organizing conformity of thought and of attitude and of opinion. Ford Foundation capital is presented as a potential tool for spreading the educational theories favored by whoever controls foundation policy. And the Ford Foundation, we learned, was a good example of how a family could protect their wealth. So this is another function of foundations. It's wealth preservation, because they're tax-exempt foundations. And so if you have this big lump of money and you can't leave it to your children, you can't invest it, because whatever you do with it, the government's going to come and take a big slice. What you can do is give it to a foundation, and then it's tax-exempt. So you create a foundation, you put all this money in there, and then you say it's for the good of society and it's for the good of the wider public, and but you still direct it. You still control the foundational. You still control the foundation policy, which means you get to still control your money without giving any of it to the government, which we are told, you pay your taxes. It's the good thing to do. Paying your taxes is the way that you benefit the public and those who need those who are in greater need than yourself. Okay, and that's how you contribute. That's how you do right by the wider society. And yet these foundational organizations, which are apparently working for the benefit of everybody, they avoid paying tax. So it's strange, that, isn't it? Bit of a contradiction there. How do we resolve that? Academics and institutions are described as financially vulnerable, right? So this makes it hard for them to resist the allure of this foundation money, and of course they have to accept the strings that come along with it. And then there's a dean here, Stephen M. Corey, who's cited as warning that foundations were increasingly deciding the research problems universities should study. So there you go. That's the conditions being attached to the money being doled out. Then there was the claim that foundations became, to a substantial degree, directors of education in the United States. And then this led to the creation of accrediting bodies, civic groups, professional groups, and educational associations, and these were described as instruments for implementing foundation-backed reforms. So you've got the foundations, they fund the studies, and the academics who write the books, and they conclude that these are the reforms that need to happen, and then all of these other bodies spring up around to bring those reforms into reality. It's a very clever system because it looks authentic, it looks legitimate, and it looks scientific, right? People at this time are being conditioned to turn away from that silly superstition. Don't be thinking about gods and demons and angels and the afterlife and soul and spirit, right? Forget all that stuff. We can't measure it with a ruler, therefore it doesn't exist. Don't worry about that. We need to go down the rational, scientific route. And again, this links back to Bacon, who is thought of as one of the founders of rational deductive empiricism. I think I'm getting that right. Deductive empiricism. I'm quite new to Bacon and the 1600s and these sorts of topics, so I might be getting that wrong. But he is credited as kind of one of the fathers of modern scientism, the scientific method. So it does link, and it goes back quite a long way. But even in his time, in Bacon's time, there was a much like religion and belief in God, and Christianity had a much wider, stronger influence and grasp over things back then. So even in his New Atlantis, the community of Ben Salem, which is the sort of scientific utopia depicted in that book, they are Christian, and they signal this to the narrator and his crew who end up kind of lost in the seas, and they wash up on the shore of Ben Salem. They signal this by putting a cross on the parchment that they communicate to them, and they make them swear an oath on Jesus that they haven't killed anybody in the last 40 days, and this is what allows them to come into the city and off their ship to be welcomed, right? So Christianity is a major theme in that book. However, it's very clear, it becomes clear that even though they are maybe nominally Christians or Christians on the surface, this clique of knowledgeable, scientific, House of Solomon fathers and elders and elites, they are actually the esteemed, venerated people in the society, and they don't mention really anything about Christianity or Jesus. So it's quite curious. But anyway, back to the notes. Key groups that are named in the book include the American Council on Education, the National Education Association, the Progressive Education Association, the John Dewey Society, the National Council on Parent Education, and American Youth Commission. So you can see here you've got your councils and your associations and your commissions, and it all sounds very authentic and above board and robust and reliable and clean and secular, and commissions and councils and associations would not be smuggling in subversive ideology, would they? Because they're impartial and they're objective. And this is the assumption that this whole scam sort of rests on. Columbia, Stanford, and Chicago universities are presented as major experimental centers where foundation-backed educational radicalism developed. Particularly, we know Chicago was a Rockefeller-founded operation. That's Wikipedia for the reference point on that. Foundations steered the education system through money, accreditation, research agendas, and professional associations. So there you go. So there's a little bit further down about John Dewey, and this is quite interesting to me. I didn't realize, because we know of John Dewey, the Dewey Decimal System. It's to do with like labeling and storing books in a library or something like that, I think. But we were told in this last chapter that John Dewey's philosophy is destructive of tradition, destructive of absolute truth and basic values, destructive of natural law, and destructive of inalienable rights. Because he's a relativist. Deweyite relativism helped clear the way for collectivist political ideas. And this is a very important way by which things are subverted, the importance, the value, the inherent rights of the individual human are cast aside, brushed aside for the greater good, for the benefit of the group. And that's basically what collectivism is all about, right? And as Geo Griffin would say, I watched recently Derek Brose's documentary, the finale to his Pyramid of Power series, part 16, and it's in two halves, about who or what is at the top of the pyramid, right? It's a very interesting little documentary. Lots of ideas from various researchers and writers. But Geo Griffin says that ultimately it's an ideology, and it's between the individualist versus the collectivist. And it's quite useful to see that, because this collectivism, communism, communitarianism, they're not all the same thing. They're all slightly different flavors. But ultimately what they amount to is that there is some nebulous group somewhere out there, and you need to take a hit on your well-being and your life and your opportunity and your freedoms for the benefit of that group who's out there somewhere. But the irony and the illogical aspect of it, of course, being that you can't have a group without individuals. Like, groups are bunches of individuals, and so it has to come down like to the rights of the individual, right? A group cannot have rights that an individual doesn't have, because the group is made up of individuals, you see. So it's quite interesting to think about these things. But yeah, Deweyite relativism paved the way for collectivism. And then we learned that Carnegie funding is connected to the American Historical Association's Commission on Social Studies. Now this, I looked this up, this Commission on Social Studies, and it's a multi-volume set of books. And the final book in the series is nowhere to be found. I can't find a physical copy of it available online anywhere. The Commission's, and this might be why, the Commission's report is presented as accepting the decline of capitalism and the emergence of collectivism. So remember, this is back in the 50s. The report is quoted as supporting transition toward a more integrated society, enlarged government functions, and abridged individual property rights. And Harold Lasky is cited as saying the report was, beneath neutral language, an educational program for socialist America. So the claim is that Carnegie money financed a blueprint for using schools to prepare children for collectivism. And that in a nutshell is the outcome of the Reese Committee and the hearings and the investigations. And this book is a kind of summary of all the evidence that went into discovering that conclusion. Quite scary and alarming and unexpected, I think a lot of people would agree. So let me just get out of this and into my other note here, because I've got a few more notes to go through. So that was the first half of the last live stream. And this was the second half. So some important stuff here. And then we're going to look at a few tabs that I have prepared. So in the second part, we learned about this person called George S. Counts. George Counts. I mean, when you think about names and how they often roll out these silly, funny, entertaining, ridiculous, kind of hard to believe names. This guy, George Counts, he ends up being, well, it tells you here, he's a leading figure in the effort to use schools to reform the political and social order. He's a professional educator. He studies education. He gets a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and he becomes a head teacher, and he leads a department, and he's also an athletics teacher and whatnot. His name is George Counts. I mean, yeah, probably just a coincidence, isn't it? But anyway, George Counts. He made a pamphlet with a really interesting title. I don't think it's written down here, but I'm going to show it you in a minute. This pamphlet, he called on teachers to unite in a militant organization. He said teachers should be militantly devoted to the building of a better social order. Schools were the way by which he envisaged a better social order could be brought about. Counts is quoted as saying teachers should seek power and use it to shape future generations. And that should be their goal, right? Counts says teachers can influence the social attitudes, ideals, and behavior of the coming generation. So that's the whole reason why these foundations have education in their sights. It's because you get to infect the minds, capture the minds, hold the minds, shape the minds of the upcoming generation and prepare them for the changes in society that you have planned further down the line. So this is why back during Big C, I was saying that people like me, my age, and my colleagues who I was with at the time, my wife and friends, I was saying we're not the targets of this. The targets of this are the down and out of society, the people who are kind of homeless and on the very edges and fringes, the elderly, and the very young, the children, right? Because the trauma of making children mask up in schools, of making them stand far apart from each other at certain arbitrary distances, that amazing oxymoron, social distancing. This was like a ritualistic, traumatic abuse perpetrated on the most vulnerable in our society. And then in the case of the elderly, it was just straight up murder. It was midazolam, it was hospital protocols. Most people who died of the Big C actually died in hospital. And it was hospital protocols that were put in place that never should have been put in place, that did the killing and the murdering of those vulnerable people, right? And then, of course, that's before you even get to the injections and all the havoc and harm that they've caused and all the mysterious illnesses that people are dealing with that have just popped up out of nowhere, coincidentally, in the last couple of years since everyone had these experimental mRNA injections. Just coincidence, another coincidence. So it's all about shaping and preparing the children for the future that's coming, right? And this is why Alan Watts said many times, all our superhero films feature people who've been augmented in some way. They have nanobots running through their blood, right? Or they have some sort of mechanical appendage, like a robot arm or a laser eye or something like that they've been enhanced and augmented by science in some way, shape, or form. Even Spider-Man, it was a radioactive spider, right, that gave him all these powers. And then Iron Man, he's got his amazing gadgets that he wears that give him all these cool abilities, and he can fly around and punch holes into walls and fly out into space and do all that kind of stuff. So children are targeted, but at this time, back in the 50s, the Hollywood mind control machine methodology wasn't quite as well established. And of course, we didn't have so much, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have access to 24/7 streaming services in our pockets. We didn't have, it was a big deal, and it took a lot of money, time, effort, organization to produce films, propaganda, TV series, and that sort of stuff. Nowadays, it's much easier, and they can get all that into the minds of children by way of screens, smartphones, black mirrors, this kind of technology. But back in the 50s, school was the best opportunity to get at young people. School was the best opportunity to shape and mold their minds, right? And so this is why I think there's such a big emphasis on the part of the foundations to get their tendrils into the schools. But to return back to George Counts, that name, Counts says teachers can influence. I just read that bit. So we got another guy we learned about, which is Theodore Brameld. He was a radical educator, and he was urging liberal educators who favor collectivism to study Marxist methodology. Another one was Norman Wolfel, quoted as suggesting press control might be necessary, like Russian or Nazi press control. He said, quote, "It might be necessary, paradoxically, for us to control our press as the Russian press is controlled and as the Nazi press is controlled." Wolfel, I don't even know how to pronounce that name. He also rejected Christian tradition, capitalist profit, and inherited moral codes. He said the last thing that would interest modern youth is the salvaging of the Christian tradition. And Worms is telling us about these quote-unquote educators, such as Wolfel and Brameld, and there's also Gunnar Myrdal. Worms is saying that these educators were very prominent in the National Education Association. So again, it's an association, sounds innocent and benign and boring even. Most people think, I don't want to, why would you want to look into an association? But who are the people in there? What's their ideology? Where do they come from? What are they saying and publishing? This is why reading is so important, of course. So the Progressive Education Association is also mentioned. But and Worms is very fair and even-handed in his analysis, because he says here that it's useful if it's confined to teaching methods, right? So how do you teach in the classroom? How do you communicate an idea? How do you set up a classroom? How do you introduce an idea? I studied a lot of this back when I was an English teacher. There's different methods. There's ways of getting people activated and thinking about a subject and a topic before you teach them the new information, and ways of practicing it and embedding it and recalling it. So you're not just standing there giving a massive speech and spiel and hoping some of it sticks and some of the students remember some of it, right? But Worms says Progressive Education Association could be useful if it was focusing just on methodology of teaching. But it becomes dangerous when the leaders of this association are promoting collectivist indoctrination. There was a journal called the Social Frontier, and this accepted the analysis of the Carnegie-financed Commission on Social Studies. Right, that was the commission which found that America was heading into a collectivist type of phase. Now, there's a good example here of how rebranding works and happens so often, because the Progressive Education Association was rebranded to the American Education Fellowship. Maybe they've been reading a bit of Tolkien and they thought, we gotta switch things up around here. People are getting into Tolkien. Let's change it. Let's change our association into a fellowship. But the takeaway is that progressive education is framed as a political project disguised as educational reform, right? So reform, again, it's like the word progress. People think progress is a good thing and reform is a good thing, because they assume that the reform will only get rid of the things that aren't working and the things that are bad and leave what's good, and it'll be a process for the better. They assume that, but that's another dangerous assumption to make, and it's another core assumption which the success of these maniacs depends on us all making. The author also told us, so Wormser told us, that collectivist textbooks replaced standard and objective school books, which gave students a pathological view of their own country. So turning students against their own country. Excuse me. The foundation-backed textbook writers have an advantage because of the financial support and institutional approval of the foundations, you see. So they get more amplification, they get more funding, so they have more time to work on producing and churning out the propaganda. There's another fellow here called Harold Rudd who created a bunch of textbooks, and these are described as notorious. These textbooks were financed by the Rockefellers by way of the Lincoln School, and 5 million copies of these were sold up to 1940. The books themselves were banned in California after a panel of judges called them reprehensible. It's a fantastic word. And the panel also objected to the idea that schools should plan the future of society. I mean, you don't put children in charge. Everyone knows that, right? But we're getting to that phase now where you've got like a classic example, Greta Thunberg, you know, how dare you? It's like, you're a child, go home, let the adults have a conversation here. But it's strange because they're talking about lowering the age of voting, I think, here in the UK to, I don't know, whatever, it down to 16 maybe, or even lower than that. I think that was some idea that was floated by the Labour Party. So the idea is like, there's some, again, it's one of these ideas that sounds good and there's a kernel of truth in there. You know, young people, children, they are valuable, fully fleshed out members of human beings, right? They have all the same attributes and vital qualities that adults have. Dreams, desires, goals, fears, skills, opinions, humor, talents, all that stuff. It's all there. I mean, it's there from a very young age. I think, you know, now that I'm kind of a father, I reflect often on how sort of fully formed my son is. Even though he can't talk yet, he has the full range of emotions and facial expressions and ways of non-verbal ways of communicating. It's quite amazing. We often think of babies as these in sort of, I don't know, that we often think of them as a kind of wiggling type of animal rather than a human being with all the dimensions that we think grown human beings have, right? But I think that's a mistake. However, we don't put the children and the babies in charge of planning things and steering society and telling us where we need to go, right? Because that's how you end up living in idiocracy. And, you know, we are kind of in idiocracy, unfortunately. But so, yeah, this panel, they stepped in. They said children shouldn't be planning the future of society. And they also said that these books overstressed national weaknesses and injustice. So it's that, like, focusing overwhelmingly on what's wrong with your country, what's wrong with your culture, what's wrong with Christianity. And then you end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So we've got and then continuing on this topic of textbooks, there was another series called the Building America Textbook Series, which was a foundation-financed effort. And this was Rockefeller's General Education Board, which provided the funding this time. And then the National Education Association promoted the books. So that was before it rebranded itself as a fellowship. California barred these books after the Dilworth Committee judged them Marxist and destructive of American traditions. So when you think about cultural Marxism and how did it get into our schools and universities and why are all our young people indoctrinated with this, not just the young people, but it's been a long time coming, right? They've been trying to do this and had efforts knocked back in various places over time, but this is, you know, coming up on 100 years, probably over 100 years old by now, but this is not a new thing that's sprung up out of nowhere. The books are accused of distorting American history, belittling American statesmen, glamorizing Russian leaders, and presenting Soviet life favorably. But they don't talk about the terror, purges, concentration camps, repression, and lack of civil liberties in Russia, right? No, just gloss over those bits. Then we also learned about a couple of authors here, E. Merrill Root and A.H. Hobbes, who argue that modern social science textbooks were slanted left. Now, they did a couple of books, and I'll show you those now. If I just switch quickly over to the book cam. So this is Collectivism on the Campus, E. Merrill Root, and this is from Devon Adair Company, one of my favorite publishers who are no longer operating, but a lot of, like, Devon Adair also did the Foundations book. You can tell it's the same style, right? Devon Adair Company, Foundations at Power and Influence, also published Collectivism on the Campus, E. Merrill Root, Devon Adair Company, right there, 1955. So this one was a bit earlier. So that's one worth looking into and getting hold of if you can. And the other one is the claims of sociology, a critique of textbooks by A.H. Hobbes from the University of Pennsylvania. And this is 1951. Right, so if you're wondering why all our children are indoctrinated with Marxism, I mean, this has been happening for 70 years at this point. And people have been writing books about it, warning about it, explaining it, pointing it out. And yet it happened anyway. It must just be because Marxism is such a superior philosophy and way of looking at the world, right? That must be it. But Hobbes, who wrote this this book I just showed you, the claims of sociology, he found that the sociology textbooks repeatedly emphasize social change, social planning, economic security, and expert control. He wrote that the control of social processes by long-range subjection of society to guidance by social scientists. That was what he was finding when he went through these textbooks that were being put into schools and taught to children as facts. So the takeaway here is textbooks became vehicles for replacing tradition, patriotism, religion, and free enterprise with social planning and collectivist sentiment. So that's the end of my notes that I wanted to walk you through and remind people of the last section, and I've got a couple of tabs to look at. Then we'll get into today's reading. Oops. Hopefully the audio is still coming through. Looks like we are still live, maybe a few seconds behind on Odyssey. So we're still having that same lag that we were having last time over there. Sort your shit out, Odyssey. Not too far behind, though. Oh, no, it is quite a ways behind. It's quite a long ways behind. All right. Well, that's good to know. It was a bit of a test to see if Odyssey would work or not today. I guess we have our answer. Okay. So, this is the book that I can't find a physical copy of. It's called Conclusions and Recommendations of the Commission. So this is the final volume in the American Historical Association's investigation of the social studies in the schools. So remember, social sciences and sociology was a big part of the chapter on scientism. And what we were told, what Wormser tells us really, is that it's not a science. Sociology is not a science, but it's been labeled as a science to give it this air of credibility that really isn't there when you scratch below the surface. And so what's it being used for? Well, it's being used to recommend policies to shape society. And that whole chapter was a very interesting one and worth revisiting if you didn't catch that one. That'll be part 5 in the series, maybe part 4 and part 5. I can't remember if we spread that over 2 parts. But this book is the outcome of the American Historical Society investigation. And we just learned in the notes there, in the recap, that this admitted and found some quite amazing stuff, namely that the era of Christianity, of individualism was over or coming to a close, and a new era of sort of secular collectivism was coming in. So I thought, well, it wouldn't be good to have a copy of that book in my collection. Can't find one anywhere. And if you try and read the Internet Archive version, you only get that far before you have to use an account to quote unquote borrow this collection of ones and zeros. I'm not going to give them my data, and I don't have an account, and so I'm not going to borrow this collection of ones and zeros. But if anyone out there can source maybe an electronic copy, or maybe even better, a physical copy, that would be good. I think it'd be worth getting hold of this. It's a 1934 publication, as you can see. See Scribner's and Sons. I did find there was one book I found from this series, but it wasn't this Conclusions and Recommendations. It was an earlier volume. So that's that. I wanted to make people aware of it and just show you it's an example. Like, what's the reason for making this, for limiting this? What's the reason for not just having it out there for download? There must be something juicy in there. That's my contention. So let's see if we can move to the next tab. I've forgotten how to move through tabs. Oh, there we go. George Counts. Let's have a look at George Counts, because he's got such a great name for an educator. He counts. Like the count in Sesame Street, right? Ha 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 ha. 1 bat, 2 bats. So George Sylvester Counts. He was an American educator and influential education theorist. He looks very serious as well, doesn't he? He has a mugshot there. He was an early proponent of the progressive education of John Dewey. He became its leading critic and was affiliated with the school of Reconstructionism, social Reconstructionism. I thought, well, whenever you see an ism, you got to look into that. You got to click on that and go and find out what the hell is this ism all about. So I did that, and it took me to this page, which is critical pedagogy. And okay, what's critical pedagogy? Well, it's a philosophy of education and social movement that developed and applied concepts from critical theory. Oh, okay. What's critical theory? So we click on critical theory. Critical theory, as some of you may or may not know, was created by the members of the Frankfurt School, and here it is on Wikipedia as part of a series on the Frankfurt School. So that's as far as I went with this. We could probably look a little closer into critical theory and what a bunch of nonsense it is, but basically it's challenging objective truth. It's basically a pseudo-intellectual framework for bringing in relativism and for getting rid of absolute truth. There is no truth. Truth is relative. There's my truth and your truth, and everything. And there's no good or bad. There's no evil. There's no right or wrong. It is really just what you think it is, and you get to make it up yourself. Another man's good is another man's bad. That kind of subversive way of thinking. And I wasn't at all surprised to just make 2 clicks and find the Frankfurt School behind this. And, the book that you want to look at for that, I've got 2 books in my collection, actually, that deal with this. And so we'll just mention those. The book. So one is, we got this Critical Theory by Max Horkheimer. So Critical Theory, this is literally the book that gives Critical Theory its name, right? This is the first one. So we got a copy of this. And if you look at some of the topics in here, where's my pencil? Science, right? So science, scientism, sociology, that's going to be in there. Materialism and metaphysics. Authority and the family. That's going to be a very interesting one. Thoughts on religion, okay? Traditional and critical theory. The social function of philosophy, art, and mass culture. So, interesting book. Important one. Might be worth diving into that at some point and having a good laugh. And then the other one I wanted to mention is this Weimar on the Pacific. This was I found out about this one by way of the History of Propaganda channel on YouTube. Dwayne Hayes doing awesome work. And this Weimar on the Pacific is German exile culture in Los Angeles and the crisis of modernism. And basically what this book tells you is how the Frankfurt School and all its teachers and thinkers and leaders and the men who ran that were exiled from World War II Germany. World War II Germany, that's not the right way to phrase it, but in the lead up to World War II and during World War II, right? They were kicked out, and they found refuge on the west coast of America. And they ended up in places like Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken, and they were living very close to Aldous Huxley, for example. I think Dwayne Hayes on History of Propaganda does a really good job of showing their homes, where they lived, pulling up the maps, and connecting a lot of these people to Huxley. And so this is quite amazing, and I'm looking forward to getting. And then you've got Max Horkheimer, who's mentioned here. He's in one of the illustrations. So the founder, the writer of the book Critical Theory. This is how it's all kind of connecting. You got Adorno as well, interesting fella, Fritz Lang. And should we have a look quickly at Max Horkheimer, page 31? There he is. That's the father of critical theory. So there's another couple of books worth looking into that link and connect and help flesh out the context and the continuity of what's going on here. But for now, we'll go back to our little preamble ramble tabs. So that's the Frankfurt School, part of a series on critical theory, which is part of critical pedagogy, which George Counts was affiliated with a school of social reconstructionism, where critical pedagogy was fleshed out and pushed and developed, I suppose. But back to this character. Counts wrote dozens of important papers, 29 books about education. He was highly active in politics as a leading advocate of teachers' unions and the head of the American Federation of Teachers. So there we've got a federation. It's a federation. It's an association. It's a fellowship. I wonder why they picked federation and not fellowship. He also founded the New York State Liberal Party. They've got a very nice, there we go, New York State Liberal Party. And he was a candidate for the U.S. Senate. Now, this there's a couple of bits here that gave me a chuckle when I was reading them, right? Counts graduated from Baker University in 1911 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. He then became a high school principal. So things were very different back in 1911. You could become a principal or head teacher, as we call them here in England, with just a Bachelor of Arts degree. Nowadays you can't even like get a job at McDonald's with a Bachelor of Arts degree. So, how times have changed. But yeah, he graduated with his degree, went straight into becoming a high school principal, which makes you wonder what the other teachers' qualifications were in that school. But he was teaching science and math and athletics. Then he went to graduate school at the University of Chicago. So remember, the University of Chicago, as I have open on another tab here, I think, just to remind people, University of Chicago, founder John D. Rockefeller in 1890. And it was a private research university. And it had an endowment of $10.9 billion. That's just to remind people, though. So, graduate school, University of Chicago, and he was influenced by John Dewey, the relativist. Counts earned a doctorate in education from the University of Chicago. His experience studying sociology under Albion W. Small during this period is attributed for encouraging Counts to concentrate on the sociological dimension of educational research. Into his profession. In his early career, Counts' first position was head of the Department of Education at Delaware College. I stopped. What, his first position was head of a department? So this man is definitely, doors are opening for him, right? It would be interesting to see if he knew any funny handshakes. But yeah, first job out of university is principal, and then his first job out of grad school is head of a department. Like, okay. He was a professor at Harris Teachers College. He taught at the University of Washington, and then Yale, and then the University of Chicago. So full circle in the end. In 1926, this is the interesting bit, Counts returned to the University of Chicago. The next year, he began a remarkable tenure at Columbia University Teachers College. He remained there until he was forced to retire in 1955, but it doesn't tell us the context or circumstances around why he was forced to retire. In 1930, Counts wrote American Road to Culture, which is a book, and that's a global perspective on education. In this book, he identifies 10 controlling ideas in U.S. education. Regarding this book's case about American schools, H.G. Wells said, quote, "The complete ideological sterilization of the common schools of the Republic is demonstrated beyond question. The sterilization was deliberate." What a quote. That's in the Shape of Things to Come, chapter 2. The sterilization, right? So knowing these elitists, knowing their obsession with fertility and population management, population control, that's a very apt word, I think, to describe what's going on in the schools. Sterilization. And H.G. Wells said himself, he said, the master propagandist, well-funded advocate of scientism and the scientific worldview and the scientific humanism and socialism, he said the common schools were sterilized deliberately. But the really interesting thing, which George Counts published, was a pamphlet called Dare the School Build a New Social Order. And I haven't highlighted this bit, so I might just read it through because it's only a couple of paragraphs. So, after publishing 2 comparative studies of the Soviet education system, Counts was invited to address to the Progressive Education Association, prior to it rebranding itself as a fellowship. His papers, delivered over 3 speeches, formed the core of the book Dare the School Build a New Social Order, which was published in 1932. Counts provides an examination of the cultural, social, and political purposes of education, and proponents the deliberate examination and navigation of teaching for political purposes. Right? So this is a key part of what Worms is talking about here in Foundations, Their Power and Influence, is that these organizations were crossing the line into politics and political ideology and advancing and furthering a political agenda. But they were doing it very cleverly, and they were doing it with some sort of plausible deniability. That's covered earlier in the book as part of what the commission found. They're supposed to be impartial. They're supposed to be apolitical. They're supposed to just fund and advance and enhance things for the common good, the greater good for the public at large. But actually, they were found to have to be politically motivated and politically charged, largely left-leaning, collectivist, socialist types of politics that they were slipping in while nobody was watching. But back to this pamphlet. In his address, Counts proposed that teachers dare build a new social order through a complex but possible process. He explained that only through schooling could students be educated for a life in a world transformed by massive changes in science, industry, and technology. Counts insisted that responsible educators cannot evade the responsibility of participating actively in the task of reconstituting the democratic tradition and of thus working positively toward a new society. So what does that mean? Reconstituting the democratic tradition. Counts' address to the PEA and the subsequent publication put him in the forefront of the social reconstructionism movement in education. And as we just looked at the top of this page, that links back to the Frankfurt School and critical theory, which is just relativism in a word. Conservative educators attacked the premise of Counts' assertion, and progressive educators recoiled at his criticism of their practices. So he managed to piss everybody off. So that's good. That's actually a good sign. That stands in his favor. W.E.B. Du Bois issued a rebuttal to Counts' assertions that teachers were capable of building a new social order. In 1935, he spoke to a Georgia African American Teachers Convention, curtly discounting the nature of the education system today. So, there you go. That is George Sylvester Counts and his probably two publications worth looking into there. One, the American Road to Culture 1930 book, which H.G. Wells says shows us the complete sterilization of the common schools, and then also his pamphlet Dare the School, Build a New Social Order. Looks like there is a Wikipedia page on it, but it doesn't really tell us anything. And that is that for today's Preamble Ramble. Bloody hell. I just locked my laptop. Okay. Tell I'm a bit rusty. Not quite as smooth as I would like it to be. So, that's today's Preamble Ramble. We're going to get into the book, read a little more, and then we'll wrap it up. I hope everybody's doing well. If you're watching live and if you're tuning in for the replay. If you want to support the stream at any point, it's allmylinks.com/HazeReviews. You can see it down there at the bottom going along. You can sign up for continuityofcontrol.com, which is my sort of mini course free email series delivered to your inbox weekly. It's a bite-sized way to get into these kinds of topics with quotes, books, references spanning the last 70 years. You can look at theultimatereadinglist.com. That is a full catalog of my library. And actually, it's not, because I've since bought a number of books that aren't included on that list and I need to update it. But it has 98% of the books in my library. That's a free download PDF with the book title, author, publication, publisher, and publication year. And then a lot of resources, extra resources at the back end of that PDF, where you can indulge your appetite for learning in a way that's a little more directed and focused and guided than just letting the internet algorithms serve up whatever piece of AI slop they're trying to get you to look at. Cool. I hope you're all doing well out there. And let's get into today's reading. Okay. So I've been enjoying this book, and I've been really missing live streaming and wanting to get back to the live stream, because I think this is one of the most important books we've done on the channel. And it's a good book because it's led me to lots of other books. And now I feel like I have a really good... I have a decent section of my library sort of dedicated to this topic and the people who are writing about it and warning us about it, because this topic is massively important, hugely important. And I'm sure this next chapter will reinforce what I just said. So let's get into it. This is chapter 6. Revolution is nearly accomplished. The Third American Revolution. Quote, "In the United States, we have had two violent revolutions, that which freed us from England and that which sought to divide us. I suggest we are now in the Third American Revolution, none the less serious because it is bloodless. This new revolution is a reform movement gone wrong. It has become an attempt to institute the paternal state in which individual liberty is to be subordinated and forgotten in a misapplication of the theory of the greatest good for the greatest number." I wrote these words in an article published in the American Bar Association Journal of May 1953. My statement may not have been entirely accurate. Instead of saying we are in the Third Revolution, I might better have said that it is nearly finished, that all that can be hoped for is a counter-revolution. Liberals have frequently announced that the revolution is over. So said Dr. Mortimer Adler, upon whose judgment the Ford Foundation, through its Fund for the Advancement of Education, relied so heavily as to put him in charge of the philosophical study of freedom, spending $600,000 on support of his philosophical education. And I'll just say as an aside, Mortimer Adler wrote this excellent book how to read a book. And it's a really good book about reading books. You know, what more could you want? It's very well written. It's full of useful advice, tips, tricks. Not tricks, actually, but very good methods and practices to level up your reading skills and abilities. And I find it very valuable. It's a good one. So that's Mortimer Adler. He also edited, he also had something to do with the great Books of the Western World series, which I have a copy of, published by the Encyclopedia Britannica. And that includes the Syntopicon, which is a kind of it's sort of an index of the 52 or 53 books or authors, I should say, that are included in the Great Books of the Western World. It's kind of an index of all those books, thinkers, writers, and authors, and what they had to say about various ideas. So the first one in the Syntopicon is angels, or that's it. Obviously that's in the A section. I don't know if it is the first one. It's probably not, is it? But yeah, the Mortimer Adler is quite a well-known, well-respected academic in the realm of reading, writing, and dealing with big ideas. So let's go back to the text here. Professor Seymour E. Harris of Harvard has put it this way, quote, "In the 20 years between 1933 and 1953, the politicians, college professors, and lawyers, with little help from business, the people who can be... Oh, sorry, I skipped a page there. With little help from business, wrought a revolution in the economic policies of the United States." Professor Harris should have added that the revolution was materially aided by foundations. Over the past few decades, the major foundation complex has operated almost as an informal but integral arm of government, acting to a very considerable extent as its collateral brain trust and determining policy. If a revolution has indeed been accomplished in the United States, we can look here for its motivation, its impetus, and its rationale. Communist penetration of foundations. A good part of the impetus of the revolution came from Marxists. To what extent some of it came from actual communists, we shall probably never be able to piece together adequately, but there can be equally little doubt that much of it was communist-inspired. The presence of so many disclosed communists in government during the New Deal and Fair Deal eras makes this conclusion inevitable. There is, moreover, much evidence that communists made substantial, direct inroads into the foundation world, using its resources to promote their ideology. The Reece Committee has been castigated for asserting that subversive influences have played a part in the history of foundations in the United States, yet it was its predecessor, the Cox Committee, which made this utterly plain, and insofar as actual communist penetration of foundations was concerned. That committee produced evidence which supported its conclusion that there had been a Moscow-directed specific plot to penetrate the American foundations and to use their funds for communist propaganda and communist influence upon our society. There was also evidence that this plot had succeeded in some measure. We shall never know the full extent of this penetration, but testimony before the Cox Committee disclosed that the Marshall Field Foundation, the Garland Fund, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Robert Marshall Foundation, the Rosenwald Fund, and the Phelps Stokes Fund had been successfully penetrated or used by communists. The Marshall and Garland Foundations had in fact lost their tax exemptions. The Cox investigation also disclosed that almost 100 discovered grants to individuals and organizations with extreme leftist records or affiliations have been made by some of the more important foundations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the William C. Whitney Foundation, and the Marshall Field Foundation. 100 grants were not many compared with the total grants of the foundations, but Professor Rowe made clear in the following testimony before the Reece Committee, first, that the problem is qualitative and not quantitative, and second, that the aggregate effect of communist penetration cannot be measured by merely considering the number of direct grants to communist individuals. Quote, in much of the activity that has to do with the identification of communist activity in the United States, it has seemed to me that we are going off on the wrong track when we limit ourselves to efforts to identify overt communists, or let us say organizational communists, people who carry a card or who can be positively identified as members of an organization subject to organized discipline. For every one of those that you fail to identify, and it seems to me we even fail to identify most of those, there are 1,000 people who could not possibly be identified as such because they have never had any kind of organizational affiliation. But among those people who are many people who advance the interests of world communism, in spite of the fact that they are not subject to discipline and do not belong to any organization. The people who can be trailed and tagged by the FBI are a very, very small minority. They occupy a very powerful position and a potentially important one, but the people who do the important work are unidentifiable, and if I were planning to infiltrate the United States, I would see to it that they were unidentifiable. Here it seems to me you have to set up an entirely different category than the two categories of communists on the one side and other people on the other side. I would like to add this regarding the IPR and regarding the problem of Far Eastern policy. You remember some of my earlier remarks about the state of Far Eastern studies in the United States 20 or 30 years ago, how I said there was practically none of it, how some of the foundations started to finance the building up and training of personnel. It seems to me this kind of thing has to be taken into account in evaluating foundation grants, namely that the area of ignorance in the United States about Far Eastern matters was so great that here was the strategic place in which to strike at the security of the United States by people interested in imperiling our security and fostering the aims of world communism. They would naturally not pick the area in which we have the greatest intellectual capacities and in which we have the greatest capacities for defense. They would pick the area of greatest public ignorance, with the greatest difficulty of defending against the tactics of their attack. And so these people naturally poured into Far Eastern studies and exploited this area as the area in which they could promote the interests of world communism most successfully in the general ignorance and blindness of the American people. So that it is not only quantitative evaluation that counts, it is not only the numbers of grants or the amounts of grants, it is the areas in which the grants are given that are significant. Here, you see, it seems to me it takes a great deal of subjective matter know-how, quite apart from the dollars and cents, people and their affiliations or lack thereof, to evaluate the impact on this country of any given foundation grant. I don't care whether it's $50 or $5 million. It is a qualitative matter, not a quantitative matter. So that's quite a persuasive argument there. Well, it was only, it's not that many grants that we gave out. Yeah, but it's about applying, like I've said many times, you don't give out money unless you expect a return. So a lot of thought, a lot of care, a lot of analysis goes into deciding where this money gets allocated. And you have to allocate it cleverly. You have to allocate it where you're going to get the best return. And that doesn't mean throwing loads of money out. It means being strategic and funding the people, the organizations, the studies, the groups which are going to have the most impact further down the road. Okay, that's just logic. That's just logical. So the next section here is socialist penetration. The two recent congressional investigations were largely concerned with subversion. The Cox Committee interpreted this term to include only international communism of the Stalinist brand and organized fascism. The Rees Committee, in the course of its work, came to give the term broader or deeper meaning. Neither investigation established sharply, however, the characteristics of communist activity which would be clearly held to be subversive. In the public mind, the term subversion is generally confined to Moscow-directed communist activity or that of domestic communists allied in an international conspiracy. The emphasis on a search for organized communist penetration of foundations absorbed much of the energy of the investigators and detracted somewhat from the efficacy of their general inquiry into subversion. There are varieties of communist sectarian programs and propaganda of a dissident nature, aside from those directed from Moscow. A follower of Trotsky's brand of communism may be no less a danger to our society because he opposes the current rulers of Russia. It is likely that there are more Trotsky followers in the United States than followers of the Kremlin. Even among the formerly orthodox supporters of the party line, there has occurred a mass conversion to a domestic form of the communist theory and method. Moreover, it is difficult to mark the line beyond which socialism becomes communism. The line may be between methods of assuming power, communism being distinguished from other forms of socialism by its intent upon establishing a dictatorship of the proletariat. But this line is by no means clear. So I'm reminded here at this point of the Fabian Freeway, which we read on the channel, and also the Milner-Fabian conspiracy. And in both these books, they give the linkage between socialism and communism as one is simply the transitional stage that comes before the other. Namely, you have capitalism, and to transform capitalism into communism, you need to first introduce socialism. And that's the gradual transformation and transitioning into the communism. So it's actually a kind of an evolution. It's more like, what do you call it? It's like a sliding scale. You know, on one side you've got this, on the other side you've got that. But even that way of characterizing it, we know is kind of a false managed dialectic, because as we're seeing in this book, it's wealthy industrial capitalists that are funding the spreading of the leftist, socialist, communist ideology. So it's very strange to see that both the wealthy free market capitalist industrialists are funding this ideology of socialism. It's quite strange, right? It's one of the things that people struggle with, but it's one of the best ways. It's one of those like paradigm shifts that help crack you open into a more accurate way of thinking about how the world really works. But it's worth revisiting those two books and some of those live streams for a recap of this, because both those books go into good level of detail on this distinction between socialism and communism. So continuing here, socialism has the same ends as communism, though with an allegedly democratic approach. The Communist Manifesto of 1848 is the basis of all socialist parties the world over. Marx himself did not distinguish between socialism and communism. Both advocate centrally planned controls of production and consumption by the state, public ownership of the means of production, and confiscatory measures. They have in common the concept that, through a manipulation of public affairs, man can attain lasting happiness for all, can make want and misery disappear, can eradicate war, and can produce paradise on earth. So it's a kind of utopianism. And while I mention that it's a kind of utopianism, I will tell you that very soon I'm going to be interviewing Daniel McCarthy about his book, The Story of Nowhere, which is a really good little pocket book that gives you an overview of utopianism and its effect on bringing us to where we are in the world today. And it's a 2020 book. It's really nicely printed. It's got diagrams and pictures. It's very easy to read. And I'm inviting Daniel on for a discussion about this book on Hayes Reviews. Hopefully going to get that recorded in the next week or two, so keep an eye out for that. That'll be episode 8 of Hayes Interviews, I should say. So that's coming. So utopianism, that's what they're talking about here. We can solve all the problems, paradise on earth, war will disappear, everybody will have as much as they need. We get to decide how much they need. No, they don't mention that bit so often. But let's continue here. The major distinction between the two forms of socialism, as asserted by the communists, is that they believe in the necessity of a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat before reaching the golden age of social justice And universal happiness. Sounds lovely. America has had a long tradition of socialist fads and has listened long to utopian arguments. In the 19th century, there were numerous socialist communities in the United States. Robert Owen, the founder of the cooperative movement and probably the most important of the pre-Marxian socialists, addressed the Congress of the United States more than 125 years ago. He preached production for use instead of production for profits. He advanced the generally discredited theory of surplus value exploited by Marxism in calling the proletariat to arms in a class war held to be unavoidable. The failure of our numerous experiments in communism has not ended a longing for better forms of social organization. This longing is evidenced in the ease with which preachers of utopian economic systems still gather large followings. The mandates of both the Cox and Rees committees went further than a mere exploration of subversion. The Cox committee was to inquire into activities which were not in the interests or tradition of the United States. The Rees committee into the support of, quote, un-American activities. These terms are almost impossible to define with complete certainty. They can only be related to a priori standards of value, standards which cannot be arrived at through an empirical approach. There are conflicting ways in which historical facts can be interpreted to provoke what the tradition of the United States may be. One can make a case for the claim that various types of sectarian socialism are traditionally characteristic of parts of our farm population. One can submit proof in the form of data about continued devotion to ideas originally promoted by early religious community settlements and their survival in various forms of federal farm support and soil banking schemes. However, there was sufficient general clarity in the mandates of the two committees for inquiry purposes. Socialism is basically antithetical to our system. There you are. Socialism is antithetical to our system. And I'm impressed here that he mentions how it's difficult to define these things, and you can't necessarily do it with an empirical approach, you know. And remember, this links back to my discussion with James Corbett about New Atlantis and Francis Bacon's role in bringing in an empirical scientific method and view and approach to the world, and how that ties in to everything that we're reading now. So there is a continuity, there is a long legacy of these ideas, and they've had to be planted and watered and nurtured and grown and carefully looked after, and then uprooted and planted somewhere else, right? Incubated, and so there's definitely value in understanding some of these older texts and how they link. And when you dive into them, you can start to see the links quite easily. But continuing here, all socialists do not recognize themselves as such, but it is, after all, their private affair. They are entitled to be socialists if they care to, whether or not they are aware that socialism cannot exist without force and oppression. That's a very important part to bring up to any socialists in your life who you might be arguing with at the dinner table. Tell them and point this out. Socialism cannot exist without force and oppression. It must otherwise fail for economic reasons. In a democracy, the citizen has the right to his reasonable mistakes, disastrous as they may be to the public welfare. The free contest of ideas would usually save us from such evils as doctrinaire socialism. But in our country, the free market for ideas has rapidly declined. The one-sided support by foundations of the utopian socialists has created a constricted and limited marketplace. That's a key quote, I would say. On the free market for ideas being captured by the foundations. So continuing. So the real problem which faced the two recent investigations was the imbalance in the struggle of ideas created by the preference of foundation giving in the 2 decades from 1930 to 1950. The virulent criticism to which congressional investigation of foundations has been subjected has perverted an investigation of this imbalance into an alleged attack on civil liberties. The true problem is not whether socialists or extreme liberals are respectable and entitled to their views, but rather that their opponents have been discriminated against in the allotment of funds by major foundations. The ascendancy of socialistic ideas is attributable, partly at least, to this foundation-created imbalance. The Rees Committee did not disparage liberalism. It said, "We cannot too strongly state that this committee respects the true liberal and deems him as important to the proper political functioning of our society as is the conservative." It did attack the kind of person who calls himself a liberal but is not. Such a, quote, liberal, said the committee, quote, travels in, if not under, the same direction as communism. He may even be, quote, a violent and inveterate opponent of communism, but he gives it support by falling into, quote, the error of wishing to destroy before he knows the significance of that with which he wishes to replace. Yeah, that's a very good point. How easy it is now to whip up students into a frenzy, smash the system. You've got all your Just Stop Oil and activists and gluing themselves to pavements and roads and that sort of thing. And they have no conception of what could come next. And this is one of the things that Teresa Correggio talks about in her book, the How to Dismantle an Empire. And in my interview with her, we discussed this, how it's all well and good wanting to point out the flaws of the system and make people aware of them, but don't start tearing it down until you're very, very clear on what comes next and how you're going to transition into what comes next. Right? This is how revolutions are co-opted and used by the enemy, is because you can drum people up, you can rile them up into hysterical, frothing at the mouth multitudes of mobs. So they go rampaging down the streets, smashing things up and tearing things down. But because they haven't organized and thought enough about it to define what comes next and how do we implement it once we tear this thing down, then you can hijack that revolutionary spirit and that revolutionary motivation and lead it and steer it with your concept and idea of what comes next. And in fact, I posted a really good interview in my Telegram channel recently of Ian Davis. And he was talking to James Dellingpole about his book, The Technocratic Dark State, Trump, AI, and Digital Dictatorship by Ian Davis, right? And part of what he talks about in this book is something called accelerationism. Accelerationism. Let me see here if it's mentioned. It's not mentioned on the contents page. But accelerationism, I bet it's in the back here. Yes, there you go. So this is an awesome thing about this book is Ian gave us a glossary. So accelerationism. What is accelerationism? So he says, Austrian political economist Joseph Schumpeter proposed that there is a cycle of creative destruction inherent in capitalism. Technological advances lead to new markets which supersede and thereby destroy old markets. Therefore, today's neo-reactionary movement in particular argues that creative destruction should be adopted as a strategy and applied to capitalism as a whole. This process is not only essential but should be sped up, accelerated, in order to ensure that humanity is in the best possible position to deal with the inevitable singularity. Accelerationism is thus being used by investors, most notably in the new tech and cryptocurrency space, to hasten the development of technology-driven startup ventures. Governments around the world have adopted the accelerationist approach for numerous projects, what they're calling accelerators. So what he's speaking to here, and what he explains really well in the Delling Poll interview, is it's similar to this idea of a revolutionary movement which starts to tear things down before it knows what it wants to build and how it's going to transition into that new thing that it wants to build, right? They don't tend to get that far before they start rioting and looting and smashing things up. What this lot are doing, and this is also covered in Courtney Turner and Patrick Wood's book, The Final Betrayal. I interviewed them as well on Hayes Interviews. You can look that up, episode 2. So both of these books are talking about, are talking about this accelerating of the collapse of the current systems. Okay, they're not fit for purpose. They've come to their end. Basically, they're ready to collapse, and these Silicon Valley oligarchs, these tech goblins, they want to accelerate the collapse so that they can be there with their solutions to step in and take control once the collapse has happened. Yeah. And so you can expect people to be indoctrinated into this idea of, like cheering on the collapse, cheering on the end of fiat currencies, not realizing that what they're going to get is a programmable digital currency in a tokenized market where everything on the sun is tokenized and traded on the financial markets, right? You can go to C.T. Foster's book, The Everything List, and my interview with him to get more detail on that tokenization. Hoping to have him back on pretty soon, actually, because he did a follow-up to this book. So that's what we're in now. Is this sort of, there's a revolution, things are collapsing, people are going to be conditioned into cheering it on and celebrating it, not realizing that there is a much more insidious, scary control system waiting in the wings and being built and put in place, ready to be rolled out so that we can have a seamless transition into this new system once the current one is finally detonated and collapses and takes a lot of people out with it, right? That's what's going to happen, because most people are not prepared for this. And you know, if you want to get prepared for it, you want to listen to people like Parallel Mike on the Parallel Systems broadcast. He's on YouTube. You can find him very easily. But that's who I would recommend listening to if you want to get prepared. But also things like making friends with your neighbors, growing some food in whatever way you can, stocking up on high quality anything, you know, any high quality, whether it's clothing, tools, things that you need on a daily basis that might become very expensive and hard to replace. Car parts, right? If you do any mechanics on repairing of your own vehicles and maintenance of your own appliances at home, right? Stocking up on the materials you need to grow food, to repair things, to clothes that are going to last a long time. These kinds of things, right? Books, in case you get locked out of the internet and you don't want to give them a scan of your eyeball. Maybe even DVDs. We've got a DVD player, and stocking up on DVDs. So you know, if you get cut off from Netflix, and you shouldn't be watching Netflix anyway because it is garbage, propaganda, mind control, slop. But stocking up on DVDs, maybe CDs, for example, right? So there's a lot of things you can be doing to prepare. But if you want to like prepare financially, that's a trickier one. I would listen to Parallel Mike. He's my favorite person to listen to on that. Not that I'm prepared at all or in a position to get prepared financially, unfortunately. But, you know, we do what we can with what we have available to us. I just noticed as well, we've got Frank in the chat, and we have also got Buho Taro. What's going on? Good to see you both there. Thank you for your messages. Buho Taro is saying, "Hi Nick, I've heard from Accelerationism through Predictive History, Professor Zhang. Probably you already know him. He's amazing. He read the whole Divine Comedy the last few weeks. It was amazing. I have seen Professor Zhang. Yeah, he has exploded onto the internet with his predictions, his forecasts, and it's quite amazing to see his meteoric, rapid ascension and rise to YouTube dominance. It's been quite a thing to behold, and I'm glad you're enjoying his material. Frank says, welcome back to the live streaming. I missed out on the notification. Hope all well with the family. Yeah, I didn't get the notification out in good time. I just thought, right, I'm going to do it because it's been too long. But I'm glad you caught on eventually. And thank you for your message. We are all doing very well. I appreciate your kind words. All right, let's get back to our reading. And continue with this chapter, which is very, very good. That was quite a big tangent there, but my point was that this thing of revolution, it's ongoing. I mean, it's a revolution because it's a wheel, because it keeps happening, right? It keeps returning us to the same place and starting again. That's what a wheel, that's the motion of a wheel does. I know wheels are used to move us big, like distances, but if you just look at a wheel and remove it from the context of like the ground and the vehicle, it just turns around and around and around and around and around. It's a cycle, in other words, right? So there's no accident that this word revolution has been used. It's a cycle, it's a process, it's well known, and it's managed, and it's never left to chance. And plenty of books on that, explaining that. A good one, Fire in the Minds of Men by James Billington. That's a classic one. So let's go back to the text. And so, continued the committee, the foundations have frequently been persuaded by these ardent men in a hurry to use trust funds for risk capital without fairly measuring the social risk. This risk capital concept, which has found such wide favor among major foundation executives, propels them into a constant search for something new, a pathological scrutinizing of what we have on the premise that there must be something better. There is much room for improvement in our society, but much of what we have is considered by the great majority of Americans sound and inviolate. The pathological liberal propulsion into taking social risks seems invariably to skip the study of what we have that is good and should be preserved. Instead, it supports change for change's sake, or on the general theory that the different thing must be better. Much of this risk-taking assists communism. And I'm reminded, as I've mentioned many times, of the British Labour Party's most recent victory in their re-election. Their entire campaign slogan was the single word, change. That was it. So a great analysis and breakdown there of the assumptions that we are all dependent upon to make so that these scams and cons can continue taking away our freedoms. So back to the text. That socialistic ideas can be legally promoted in the United States, that prominent figures have openly adopted them in the disguise of reform, does not make them any less subversive. If one accepts the concepts and principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as expressions of the existing order, then any attempt to replace them with the concepts and principles of socialism must be considered subversive and un-American. Moreover, there is continued danger that the communist who has recently been converted over to what might be called simple socialism may switch back again in his allegiance. Many of the intellectuals who departed from communism did so because they disagreed with Stalin. Some of these will still support communism of a variety differing only slightly from the old orthodoxy. If any American should know how the communists operate, it is J. Edgar Hoover. In an address on October 1955, Mr. Hoover said that the communists do their most effective work through fictitious liberals. These he defined as, quote, individuals who, through insidiously slanted and sly propagandist writings and reports, oppose urgently needed internal security measures, present the menace of communism as a myth of hysteria, urge that we tolerate the subversive acts of communists because communists are only nonconformists, pretend that the Communist Party is a political movement, and that it is improper to consider it a criminal conspiracy to overthrow our government by force and violence. Such ideas may be presented even by people of comparatively conservative leanings who fail to recognize the threat of socialism and its incompatibility with our constitutional rights. The Rene Committee report gives an example of this process out of the mouth of Mr. Pendleton Herring, president of the extremely powerful Social Science Research Council. In an address to the American Political Science Association in 1953, of which he was then president, Mr. Herring touched on a subject which is dear to the hearts of liberal extremists and very valuable to communists: civil rights. A thesis of extreme liberals is that they alone support the fundamental rights granted by the Constitution, that the rest of us are in danger of destroying these precious rights, that a conservative is almost per se against civil rights. Mr. Herring contends that he is rather conservative, but he seems to lack understanding of the fact that socialism and communism are eventually destroyers of liberty, however respectable some of their followers may appear. The Rene Committee report commented on Mr. Herring's typically liberal speech as follows. Quote, "We regard as unfortunately typical the address made in 1953 by Mr. Pendleton Herring, now president of the Social Science Research Council, to the American Political Science Association, of which he was then president. After a discussion of the position and work of the political scientist in America, and after emphasizing the necessity of empirical approaches and of observing the cultural lag theory, he launched into a tirade in the civil rights area. Let us requote for guidance the words of Mr. Hoover. It is an established fact that whenever one has dared to expose the communist threat, he has invited upon himself the adroit and skilled talents of experts in character assassination." Let us then quote from Mr. Herring's address made under the cloak of office in 2 tax-exempt organizations supported heavily with the public's money through Foundation Grace. He speaks of political quacks who ask careers for themselves through exploitation of public concern with the communist contagion. He does not identify any one man against whom he may have some special animus. His terminology, his selection of phrase, condemns as quacks whoever try to expose communists. He makes no exceptions. He does not exempt from his excoriation any congressional investigators or investigation. He indicates that investigating communists may indeed be worse than communism. He repeats the hysterical claim that books have been burned. How many and how often? Is there truly danger in the United States of book burning? He speaks of giving cool, intelligent treatment to the transmission of erroneous information and propaganda. Is it not transmitting erroneous information and propaganda to infer that there is widespread book burning in this country? He uses the term witch doctors to characterize the whole breed of exposers of communism. He speaks of contrived excursions and alarums, implying that the communist menace has been grossly exaggerated for political reasons. He refers to the whole exposure business as malarkeyism, put in capital letters. He gives us this profound comment upon our concern with the communist menace. Quote, "We must go from symptoms to the causes. A deep cause, I think, is a failure to understand the forces operating in the world around us. Why do so many Americans feel threatened? It is the stubborn complexity of world problems and the difficulties arising from ideological differences and international rivalries that lead them to seek scapegoats among their fellow countrymen." That is an astounding statement to come from one of the top rank of those who disperse the public money which foundations control. "You poor dumb Americans," he might well have said. "You are afraid of the Russian communists only because you do not understand the dears." Mr. Herring says, "Why assume that the conspiracy of communism is best exposed where the limelight shines brightest?" He forgets that it has frequently taken a glaring limelight to induce government officials to expose a communist. Witness among many cases the case of Harry Dexter White. Another example of the cloak of respectability to which Mr. J. Edgar Hoover referred, through eminence in the foundation world, is to be found in public utterances of Mr. Paul Hoffman, formerly chairman of the Ford Foundation and now chairman of its offspring, the Fund for the Republic. In an article, "To ensure the end of our hysteria," in the New York Times Magazine section of November 14, 1954, Mr. Hoffman referred to the California Senate Un-American Activities Committee as a highly publicized witch hunt. Messrs. Herring and Hoffman are not ordinary citizens expressing a personal political point of view. They have been two of the most important characters among the dramatis personae of the Foundation complex. All right, this is turning out to be another good chapter. Let's just jump ahead, see how long it is left. See how many pages are left. We've got about 14 pages left, so we might finish this chapter today. So this next section here is Foundations and Subversion. The Rees Committee concluded that because of the essential identity of evolutionary and revolutionary socialism and communism, much of the radicalism which has been supported and financed by foundations was subversive. It expressed itself as follows. Foundation spokesmen have emphatically denied any support of subversion. We question, however, whether in such denials they did not misinterpret the meaning of the term subversion. Their denials were justified insofar as they are related to the direct support of communism, but these spokesmen were well aware of the nature of some of the evidence produced before this committee, which showed that foundations had frequently supported those who wished to undermine our society. Their denials of subversion in relation to such activities are without merit. What does the term subversion mean? In contemporary usage and practice, it does not refer to outright revolution, but to a promotion of tendencies which lead, in their inevitable consequences, to the destruction of principles through perversion or alienation. Subversion in modern society is not a sudden cataclysmic explosion, but a gradual undermining, a persistent chipping away at foundations upon which beliefs rest. By its very nature, successful subversion is difficult to detect. It can easily be confused with honest, forthright criticism. In our free society, outright and honest criticism is not only permissible, but immensely desirable. Individuals who engage openly in such criticism, who criticize political institutions from a political perspective and economic institutions from an economic perspective, should be given free rein and encouraged. I suppose this speaks to the kind of slyness of concepts in books such as critical theory, right? Because on the face of it, it sounds like, well, criticism, open criticism, that's a key part of freedom of speech. That's a key part of democratic liberal society. We are free to criticize, right? And this is critical theory. So you can see how there's a sort of, again, there could be an assumption made in the minds of people to be like, oh, it's a good thing. We should study that. I mean, when I was at university, I did English literature at university. I graduated 2009. And even I had a module on critical theory. And it was I think it was mandatory. It was either mandatory or it was well known as one that you could do that there was kind of an easy pass, and so it wouldn't be that challenging, so a lot of people did it, if that makes sense. But critical theory just sounds like, open discussion of ideas in the free market of ideas, as Worms mentioned earlier in this chapter. Only there's a lot of controls and limitations put on that discussion and exchange of ideas that are hard to define and detect unless you are, involved in the witch hunt, as these fellows were were describing this hunt for leftist, socialist, communist, subversive ideologies and ideas. But yes, criticism. The issues involved in permitting open and honest criticism, however, differ vitally from the issues raised by subversion promoted by foundations. Some of these vital differences, which foundation spokesmen refused to acknowledge, much less discuss, in their conscious misinterpretation of the term subversive, are these. Fundamental to the entire concept of tax exemption for foundations is the principle that their grants are to be primarily directed to strengthening the structure of the society which creates them. Society does not grant tax exemption for the privilege of undermining itself. Although that's not true, because it does, because that's what massive amounts of our tax money is used for. You know, we're paying for our own for our own chains. We are paying for our own enslavement. We are paying for our own digital panopticon social credit system of control. And people are just paying for it. And they think, give themselves a pat on the back because they're paying their taxes and never missing a payment. And are we good people for doing that? And I'm not saying don't pay your taxes. Obviously, I'm not saying that, because if I do say that, I'll get arrested and put in a cage at some point. So keep paying your taxes, ladies and gentlemen. Please, whatever you do, don't stop paying your taxes. Reasonable license is granted to satisfy personal idiosyncrasies, with the result that there is much social waste when grants serve no truly useful purpose to society. But such tolerated waste is something far different from the impact of grants made by foundations which tend to undermine our society. Such grants violate the underlying essential assumption of the tax exemption privilege that the substantial weight of foundation effort must operate to strengthen, improve, and promote the economic, political, and moral pillars upon which our society rests. In the modern usage of the term subversion, it is no exaggeration to state that in the field of the social sciences, many major projects which have been most prominently sponsored by foundations have been subversive. Numerous examples of such foundation-sponsored projects, subversive of American moral, political, and economic principles, were offered in testimony. Foundation spokesmen failed utterly to provide any evidence that such heavily financed and prominently sponsored projects were in any real sense balanced by projects which promoted or strengthened the principles upon which our society rests. In this sense, the weight of influence of foundation tax-exempt funds applied in the social sciences has been on the side of subversion. Moreover, the subversive projects have been offered with spurious claims to science, which, with this false label, they have been awarded a privileged status. They have been offered as scientific and, therefore, beyond rebuttal. The impact of these subversive works has been intensified manifold by the sponsorship of foundations. Yep. So they're hiding behind the men in the white lab coats, the new priesthood, the authority, the objectivity, the alleged objectivity of scientism, and empirical scientific approach. Trevor McDonald says tax is theft. I agree. But I'd rather have my money stolen than be put in a cage, because I'm a coward. I don't want to live in a cage with a bunch of other men who've been put in cages. Helplessness of the citizen. This is the next section here. Unhappily, the average citizen, even the normally well-informed, has no fair chance to combat radical ideas flowing into education and into government through the agency of foundations. The writings on the partisan educators come to the attention of the professional class only. By the time the ordinary citizens know what has happened, they have been subverted. A tremendous pressure for the imposition of radical ideas has been built up, and their proponents have become well organized, entrenched, and implemented to oppose them. The report of the American Historical Association's Commission on Social Studies illustrates the inherent danger in foundation meddling in vital areas of public affairs. This report, it will be recalled, was characterized by Professor Lasky as an educational program for socialist America. It started a flow of radical ideas into education, ideas for which it is safe to say the average American would have scant sympathy. But that average American is not aware, even today, of the responsibility of this Carnegie Foundation-supported report for so much of the mischief wrought in our education system. Maybe that's why there's no physical copies of it available on the internet anywhere. The damage was done long before there was any possible hope that the people could have been alerted to defend themselves. Yes, there you go. So you don't have much of a chance against these long-term plans. And you do have more of a chance if you read and study and collect the books that they themselves publish and write. You know, it is difficult to trace. Continuing, with any exactness, the extent to which foundation-supported ideologies have passed into government or the exact courses which this flow has taken, but there is evidence enough that the flow has been full and serious. In its report for 1933 to 1934, the National Planning Board included this statement, quote, "State and interstate planning is a lusty infant, but the work is only beginning. Advisory economic councils may be regarded as instrumentalities for stimulating a coordinated view of national life and for developing mental attitudes favorable to the principle of national planning." The report acknowledged the cooperation in the scheme for more national planning of certain advisory economic councils, the Council of Learned Societies, the American Council on Education, the Social Science Research Council, a committee of this last having prepared this memorandum. I urge a reading of pages 129 to 133 of the committee report to get a more detailed idea of the concept of national planning which the Foundation-supported clearinghouses had fostered and brought into government. Consider, for instance, the report of the National Resources Committee, which took the place of the National Planning Board, which went so far as to advise a new Bill of Rights. Not satisfied, apparently, with the Bill of Rights attached to our Constitution, it contained these new rights, presumably to be guaranteed by the federal government. 3. The right to adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. 4. The right to security, with freedom from fear of old age, want, dependency, sickness, unemployment, and accident. This is the cradle-to-grave security concept. 6. I don't know what happened to 5 there. 6. The right to come and go, to speak or to be silent, free from the spyings of secret political police. And 9. The right to rest, recreation, and adventure, the opportunity to enjoy life and take part in an advancing civilization. The next section here is an example of foundation-supported anti-capitalism. It would be a vast undertaking, but well worthwhile, to attempt to ascertain how many anti-capitalist books have been foisted on the American public through foundation support. The number is indeed great. Here is one for which Andrew Carnegie, were he alive, would hardly congratulate his trustees for having financed. It is Business as a System of Power, written by Professor Robert A. Brady. So there's a new book to look into if you're interested in anti-capitalism. Under a grant from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, in an introduction, Professor Robert S. Lind says, quote, "Capitalist economic power constitutes a direct, continuous, and fundamental threat to the whole structure of democratic authority everywhere and always. Everywhere and always. Forever and ever. Amen." Dr. Brady repeatedly alleges that big business is an essential evil. The great corporations account for much of the current mischief in our society. Industrial capitalism, he says, is an intensely coercive form of organization of society, and great evils flow from it. He is very clearly a collectivist. He just does not like the capitalist system. The business system is feudal. It is completely authoritarian and anti-democratic. Its leadership is self-appointed, self-perpetuating and autocratic. War, he indicates, is essential for capitalist survival, a statement which is reminiscent of communist propaganda. The National Association of Manufacturers he likens to the Reichsverband der deutschen Industrie. And, quote, Mr. Knudsen, Edward Stettinius, and Bernard Baruch are paralleled by Mr. Ogura in Japan, Lord Beaverbrook in England, and Hermann Goering himself, a leading industrialist, Friedrich Flick, and their group in Germany. Big business, says this seer, can result in fascism. The Carnegie Corporation followed the production of this book very carefully and financed its publication. All right, the next section is about a group that we are familiar with, and those of you who followed along on the Fabian Freeway readings will also recall this group who also rebranded themselves, right? And this is the League for Industrial Democracy. Some tax-exempt organizations have been bold and forthright in promoting socialism and yet have escaped revocation of tax exemption. One is the League for Industrial Democracy. Its purpose is to educate the American people into an acceptance of socialism. Mr. Ken Earl, a witness before the Reese Committee, termed it an adjunct of the Socialist Party, and his conclusion seems amply justified. After his exposition of the socialist character of the LID, the LID, Mr. Earl concluded, quote, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, let me say that in this presentation I do not quarrel with the right of these many people in the LID and all of those who have been recipients of its awards or who have spoken to it. And I don't quarrel with their people to say and write the things which we have discussed, though I disagree with many of the things which they advocate. My thesis is this: if the LID is to continue to fill the air with propaganda concerning socialism, if it is to continue stumping for certain legislative programs, and if it is to continue to malign the free enterprise system under which we operate, then I believe that it should be made to do so with taxed dollars, just as the Democrats and the Republicans are made to campaign with taxed dollars. In his statement filed with the committee, Dr. Harry W. Laidler, executive director of the LID, attempted to show that the organization was no longer socialist and that it was educational in its activities. The fact is that comparatively few of its members, associates, and officers are now members of the Socialist Party. But no wonder. That party, as Norman Thomas, its old leader, has admitted, has shrunk. But socialism is still with us, and far stronger than in the days when there was an active and substantial party. Most socialists have gone elsewhere. Most now call themselves liberals. As for the claim that the work of the LID is educational under the law, entitling it to receive tax-deductible donations, then if that is so, said the Reese Committee, quote, something is very wrong with the law. The League for Industrial Democracy, formerly the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, the ISS, to which I have earlier referred, started life in 1905. Its name was changed in 1921, but its character remained the same. I've pointed out that it called itself a militant educational movement to promote a new social order based on production for use and not for profit, calling this a revolutionary slogan and urging the elimination of capitalism. This organization's publication, Revolt, announced proudly the wide dissemination of its inflammatory educational literature. The LID emergency publications, The Unemployed and Disarm, have reached a circulation of 500,000. Students organized squads of salesmen to sell these magazines containing slashing attacks on capitalism and the war system. Mr. Earl, in his testimony, piled up quotation after quotation to show the true character of this educational organization. They are far too numerous even to digest here, but I shall give a few from the writings and official pronouncements of Dr. Laidler, whose statement to the committee denied its radical propagandist nature, and of others of influence or importance in the LID organization, emphasis supplied throughout. Quote, "The recourse of workers and farmers now is to form a political party which they themselves control, and through which they might conceivably obtain state mastery over the owning class." That was from a publication of the LID called Revolt. The LID, I need to stop switching between LID and LID. I'll call it the LID, it's easier to say. The LID, therefore, works to bring a new social order. So the LID is LID, League for Industrial Democracy, formerly the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. The LID, therefore, works to bring a new social order, not by thinking alone, though a high order of thought is required, not by outraged indignation, finding an outlet in a futile banging of fists against the citadel of capitalism, but by the combination of thought and action and an understanding of what is the weakness of capitalism in order to bring about socialism in our own lifetime. Quote, "Watch now those little flames of mass unrest. Great energy will be generated by those flames of mass revolt. But revolt is not revolution, and even though new blankets of cruel repression fail to smother the fire and in the end only add to its intensity, that energy may be lost unless it can be translated into purposive action. Boilers in which steam can be generated, if we may work our metaphor, need be erected over the fire, and that steam forced into engines of reconstruction." Trotsky, in describing the rule of the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution, has hit upon a happy figure of speech which we may borrow in this instance. No man, no group of men created the revolution. Lenin and his associates were but the pistons driven by the steam power of the masses. The Marxist Bolshevik Party saved that steam from aimless dissipation, directed it into the proper channels. To catch and to be driven by that steam is the function of the radical parties in America today. Quote, "There are members who would pattern it, the Socialist Party of America, after the German Social Democracy and the British Labour Party, despite the disastrous experiences of two great parties of the Second International. There are members who have lost to age and comfort their one-time fervour, and members who would shrink from struggle in time of crisis." Quote, "They, the socialists, must overcome the quiescent influence of those whose socialism has been dulled by intimacy with the bourgeois world, and they must speak boldly and convincingly to the American working people in the workers' language. If their party can rise to these tasks, then perhaps capitalism can be decently buried before it has found temporary rejuvenation in a fascist dictatorship." The crucial issue of industrial civilization today is not between laissez-faire individualism on the one hand and collectivism on the other. History is deciding that question. The question for us is what sort of collectivism we want. Modern technology makes collectivism inevitable. But whether our collectivism is to be fascist, feudal, or socialist will depend upon the effectiveness with which we translate those political ideals into action. You cannot fight on the economic front and stay neutral on the legal or political front. Politics and economics are not two different things, and the failures of the labor movement in this country largely arise from the assumption that they are. Capitalism is as much a legal system as it is an economic system. And the attack on capitalism must be framed in legal or political terms as well as in economic terms. A socialist attack on the problem of government cannot be restricted to presidential and congressional elections or even to general programs of legislation. We have to widen our battlefront to include all institutions of government, corporations, trade unions, professional bodies, and even religious bodies, as well as legislatures and courts. We have to frame the issues of socialism and democracy and fight the battles of socialism and democracy in the stockholders' meetings of industrial corporations, in our medical associations and our bar associations and our teachers associations, in labor unions, in student councils, in consumers and producers cooperatives, in every social institution in which we can find a foothold. Sounds quite political to me. Quote, but the need of fighting politically within corporations and trade associations and professional bodies, as well as labor unions, is just as pressing if we think that fundamental social change can be secured in this country only by unconstitutional measures. In a revolution, when the ordinary political machinery of government breaks down, it is absolutely essential that the revolutionary force control the remaining centers of social power. In Russia, the success of the Bolshevik Revolution rested with the guilds or Soviets, which were not created by the Communist Party and which antedated the revolution. A socialist revolution in this country will succeed only if our guilds, chief among them our engineering societies, have within them a coherent socialist voice. Under a system where the basic industries of the country are privately owned and run primarily for profit, therefore, much of the income of its wealthiest citizens bears little or no relation to their industry, ability, or productivity. This, Dr. Laidler, is the man whose filed statement said the lid was educational and not socialist. So even the witnesses that they're calling up to give testimony to the Reece Committee, they're lying, just barefaced lying about what their organizations are involved in and what they're about and what they're trying to accomplish. Continuing. If the League for Industrial Democracy is entitled to tax exemption, then, like Mr. Earl, I see no reason why an organization which is frankly created for the purpose of promoting the platform of either the Democratic or Republican Party should not be tax exempt. Or is it only socialist propaganda which deserves tax exemption? Good question. Very important question. Okay, the next section here is, got about 6 pages left, and then we'll wrap it up. The American Labor Education Service. This tax-exempt organization, supported by the Ford Foundation and others, is engaged in the education of labor. Its education is of a special kind. Political education. Surprise. Its keynote was sounded in an invitation of October the 2nd, 1946, to attend a conference at Milwaukee. At the dinner, we shall consider methods labor must use when collective bargaining does not work, especially methods of dealing with the government. The Reece Committee report summarizes the nature of this foundation this way. The background of some ALES staff members, together with a list of participants in ALES conferences, suggests an interlock with individuals and groups associated with militant socialism and, in some instances, with communist fronts. The nature of the educational program of this Ford-supported organization is indicated by the subjects listed for discussion at various ALES conferences. So ALES, again, is American Labor Education Services, ALES. So subjects listed for discussion at various ALES conferences are political action for labor, political action techniques, the contribution of labor in rebuilding democratic society, the role of workers' education in political action. So lots about action there. One conference strongly stressed the urgency of participation in political action by labor and the re-evaluation of education in relation to political action. Nor was foreign policy to be neglected. International affairs for labor received wide attention, and labor was urged to take part in establishing foreign policy. Action, action, action is the constant demand. The American Labor Education Service distributes 2 songbooks. They're doing music as well. Songs useful for workers' groups, some of the music having been contributed by the communist Hans Eisler, and a rebel songbook. It circulates a series of pamphlets for workers' classes, many of which were published by the League for Industrial Democracy, some of them written by Harry Laidler, the Socialist Executive Director of the LID. Plays are provided for the education of the labouring man, many of them socially incendiary, written by such eminent educators as Albert Maltz, who served a jail term for contempt of Congress. One of the leading lights of the ALES is Mr. Mark Starr, its vice chairman, who has also been chairman of the League for Industrial Democracy. Mr. Starr has had many opportunities to exercise his influence for socialism. He has been Director of Education of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, a member of the United States Advisory Commission on Educational Exchange, labor consultant to Elmer Davis's Office of War Information, a member of the American delegation to establish UNESCO, a labor education consultant to the American occupation government in Japan, and a member of President Truman's Commission on Higher Education. He has also been chairman of the Public Affairs Committee. That's quite a list. Albert, oh, hang on, no, that was Mark Starr. Might be worth looking into him. Mr. Starr has no use for our economic system. He has explained that carefully. He is a frank collectivist. And ironic as it may be, he has been a heavy beneficiary of Ford Foundation, Fund for Adult Education, largesse, though he has expressed himself regarding foundations as follows, quote, "Colleges too often have to go cap in hand and exploit personal contacts with the uncrowned kings and agents of philanthropy. There are, of course, some foundations which delouse effectively the millions accumulated by monopolies and dynastic fortunes. But if one could choose a way for the long-time support of education, it would be done by community intelligence rather than the caprice of the big shots of big business who wish to perpetuate their names in a spectacular fashion, a process which may not in all cases coincide with the real education activity of the college." So that's he's pretty spot on there about his in his comments about foundational philanthropy. And this is our last section of the chapter. 4 pages. Leftists supplied to government by foundations. It is an understatement to say that the majority of the Reece Committee was shocked at Professor Kenneth Colgrove's revelations concerning the extent to which foundation-supported organizations had been responsible for the penetration of communists and communist sympathizers into the government as advisors. When advisors were to be selected in social science areas for our occupation, authorities in Germany and Japan, When advisors were to be selected in social science areas for our occupation authorities in Germany and Japan, Professor Colgrove submitted, as Secretary of the American Political Science Association, upon request of the government, a list of proposed political advisors, while he himself was appointed and took office as an advisor to General MacArthur, not at his own suggestion. His list was completely ignored. He found, to his dismay, that the advisors had been selected entirely from lists supplied by 2 other organizations. One was the notorious Institute of Pacific Relations, so generously supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The other was the American Council of Learned Societies, another intermediary organization heavily supported by major foundations. The communist connections of IPR have been mentioned. In the case of the American Council of Learned Societies, its executive secretary was Dr. Mortimer Graves, whose list of Communist Front associations impressed even the Cox Committee. Here we have 2 of the executive agencies of what the Reece Committee report called the concentration of power, or the complex supported by some of the major foundations. Professor Colgrove checked the list of accepted appointees. He testified as follows, quote, "We checked these names off. Some of them were known to us to be communists, many of them pro-communists or fellow travelers. They were extremely leftist. I went back to the Pentagon to protest against a number of these people, and to my amazement, I found that they had all been invited and they had all accepted, and some of them were already on their way to Japan." And remember, the Trilateral Commission was to draw Japan closer to the EU and the USA, right? That was the three. The trilateral was America, Japan, and the EU. So it's interesting to see this in the lead up to the formation of that group, because this was a couple of decades before the Trilateral Commission was founded by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who wrote Between Two Ages, which we read on this channel, the book before this one, actually. So check that out in the playlist. It's a really important text. So the committee report had this to say about Dr. Graves. We do not accuse Mr. Graves of being a communist, but it amazes us that one with so evident a lack of political and social discernment, with such apparent lack of objectivity, should be retained as a directing officer in what purports to be the representative organization for all the social sciences and humanities. Mr. Graves still holds this position, though the Cox Committee hearings brought out his extensive record of Communist Front affiliations. This leads us to conclude one of two things. Either his personal power is astounding, or the extreme political slant of an executive is deemed of no moment by that tax-exempt agency of the foundations. In writing the platform for the Communist League, Marx and Engels predicted that the proletariat would, quote, use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees. That's interesting that they use the word degrees there, isn't it? All capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hand of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as a ruling class. A considerable number of the planks of the Communist Manifesto have become part of the law of our land. That's a very important point to repeat and bear in mind and remember. But this has been accomplished not through a seizure of power by a proletariat, but through the misguided efforts. Misguided. It was just accidental. The misguided efforts of our intellectuals. I would say they are not at all misguided. They're definitely guided, but not misguided. Most of these intellectuals lead a life remote from the economic realities of society. Yeah, because they're suckling on the teat of foundation handouts. So they're never going to question that system properly and analyze it properly. It's kind of like when you hire consultants to solve a problem, the solution is always that you need more consultants to work on the problem, right? Excuse me. I haven't talked for this long for a while, so my throat's a little bit raspy, but we're almost done. Educators in general are among the most valuable of our citizens, but they usually do not know the marketplace. Their ideas of how an economy should or can run are often as impractical as they are idealistic. True, they can sometimes support unrealistic theories with a mass of empirical data, but it is usually both incomplete and unsound because it excludes vital factors not susceptible to empirical study. The undeniable fact is that the changes which have taken place in the United States were not the result of the despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production. They were the result of continuous propaganda in the form of biased education. This propaganda has nearly convinced the American people that the Marxian formula is good for it. Biased education, that's it. The fog-bound intellectuals who have advocated change on the theory that things are not as rosy as they should be, and therefore anything else would be better, have blindly permitted themselves to be led into the path of socialism. Whereas today they generally despise communism, the intellectual proponents of change in America still consider socialism as eminently respectable. They still do not see the central identity of communism and other forms of socialism. They believe that a gradual transition of our society to one in which production is for use and not for profits can prevail without any suppression of freedom. The bloody extermination of liberty in Russia is, to these intellectuals, merely an evidence that the Stalinist variety of socialism, that the Stalinist variety of socialism is reprehensible. They are disappointed lovers rather than true opponents. They are blind to this fact. Whether the approach to socialism is by way of force or soft propaganda, the system will inevitably call for the rape of the masses, for the suppression of liberty and freedom. That's another bombshell of a quote. The ideas of socialism have too long been supported in our country by fashions of thought which in turn have been heavily financed by foundations. Critics of foundation activity have wondered indeed why foundations have had so little interest in several obvious fields of venturing. They might well venture heavily into studies of what is worth preserving in our system and in our society, into education that promotes traditions and established values, into public affairs programs which promote national pride and national ambitions. Ha! Yeah, right. There is some hope. The foundations today seem to be slightly more cautious in supporting socialist politics under the disguise of education and research than before the congressional investigation took place. But caution is not enough. In addition to taking care to see that their funds are not used for antisocial purposes, it behooves them also to support constructive programs in the social sciences, in education, and in public affairs. A number of foundations have made a substantial effort to this end. The Lilly Endowment made possible, through a relatively modest grant, the publication of the incisive criticism of modern social science, to which I have referred, written by Professor Pitirim A. Sorokin, Fads and Foibles in Modern Sociology and Related Science. So there's another book to look up. So that's the incisive criticism of modern social science. Pitirim A. Sorokin, Fads and Foibles in Modern Sociology and Related Sciences. The Bollingen Foundation publishes unusually interesting books and supports scholars of merit in fields of culture usually neglected by other foundations. Even the Social Science Research Council must be given a special award of merit for recently supporting the brilliant but unorthodox work of Eric Vogelin, Order and History. The Foundation for Foreign Affairs has supported a number of authors critical of communism, socialism, and liberalism, and authors of conservative books. The Ford Foundation directly and indirectly supports some research in communism and may, in the end, contribute to a better understanding of this scourge of mankind. The work of the Earhart Foundation, the Volcker Fund, the Richardson Foundation, the Pew Foundation, the American Economic Foundation, and a few others has been unorthodox enough to support conservative writers and projects. There is still hope that the trustees of some of those foundations, which have acted as the financial underwriters of socialism in the United States, may force a change in the ways of the organizations whose cerebral management they have neglected. And that's the end of the chapter. And good to hear about a little counterweight, a little counterbalance, because it's not to say that all foundations are bad and all their money goes to the subversion of society. Again, it's about where do you get the most bang for your buck. And also, don't forget that to run an operation like this, you got to have a plausible cover, which means you have to present some sort of balance, some sort of equality when it comes to who you're funding and which side politically they might be leaning on, yeah? But that is the end of chapter 6, and the next chapter that's going to be coming up is one I'm really looking forward to, which is about foundation impact on foreign policy and internationalism. We got mention of the Rhodes Scholars in here, the UN, Foreign Policy Associations, Council on Foreign Relations, and I think that is going to be a very good chapter. Foundation Promoted Globalism is a section, and also the Institute of Pacific Relations is going to be looked at as well. So let me put my little bookmark in that page 200. We're making very good progress, and you can see there at the top that little orange marker, that's all the footnotes and references. So we've only got this much left to do now. We are over the hill, and we've got chapter 7. And let's just have a quick reminder of what other chapters are coming our way. So foreign policy is chapter 7, and then number 8 is the Ford Foundation. So a whole chapter just focusing on the Ford Foundation, and that's a big chapter. That's like 60 pages. That's going to take us a couple of sessions, I think. And then from here on, so recommendations and a plea to the trustees. And then you can have a quick look at the appendix, findings and concluding observations of the committee. And then Appendix B is the whole story of the Reese Committee. That's another 50 pages. That actually might be worth going through and getting on the record as well. I think it probably will be. So we have quite a few more live streams ahead of us discussing and looking at this book. But I hope you enjoyed today's broadcast. Let me go back to this camera here. And Frank's in the chat saying, the further into this book one gets, the huge importance of it becomes apparent, and the worse unfold one can at this remove experience the familiarity of them via our contemporary experiences. As the worse unfolds, one can at this remove experience the familiarity. Yeah. Superb, Nick, and great chapter to ease back in. God bless. Thanks, Frank. Yeah, another fantastic chapter. And yeah, like you're saying, we're living through the warnings in this book were obviously not heeded. Those pleas that we just that are mentioned at the end there, a plea to the trustees, recommendations, they were obviously not acted upon, because here we are in 2026. We just lived through the Big C event. That was massively that agenda was massively probably planned, orchestrated largely, and enhanced and supported by foundations and philanthropic tax exempt money. And this is something people need to be aware of, and it's something we should also be outraged at. I don't think we should continue to make assumptions about these groups and organizations just because they sound boring or benign. These associations, these fellowships, these committees, and these councils. This is more... These are the real corridors of power. I've said it 1,000 times, and I'm repeating myself when I mention it again, but it is not the puppeticians on the screens, on the news, reading the scripts that are written by somebody else, right? Doing their hand gestures and signaling to their the brotherhoods and the brethren and the societies that they're part of. These are all actors. Housatonic Live has been doing a lot of work recently and playing with this idea and talking about how the politics as it's presented to us is really just best thought of as a scripted, I think, soap opera. Those are my words, soap opera. But he was using the examples of Reagan. Donald Trump was a TV personality. Schwarzenegger, he went into politics. He was an actor. Reagan, of course. It's not really hidden. It's kind of right there. What qualifies an actor or an actress to be in politics? Well, it's the fact that they can mimic emotions and read from script, because that's all a politician needs to do. They just need to act, right? Which is just mimicking emotions, and read from the script that is handed to them. Memorize the lines, and regurgitate them when the cameras are rolling. And that is all. That is all. They're not professionals. They're not analysts. They're not qualified beyond being able to act and read from a script, right? And then, if you want a good reference on the dividends which pay for using this skill in service of the, the parasite class. Whoops. Then you got to look at Traitors by Don Waterson. I interviewed him on Hayes Interviews. This book is a must-read. It's good 500 pages, but it goes into the business connections, the money, the salaries, the foundations, the organizations, the groups, the think tanks, the NGOs linked to our so-called politicians, who are not, they're puppeticians, right? They come with strings attached, and those strings are being pulled by people whose names we don't know, groups, families who we're not familiar with, because they stay out of the limelight, because as Quigley says, of the Anglo-American establishment, they're happier with the realities of power rather than the appearance of power. They'd rather have the actual power and nobody know them than people know them and they just have the appearance of power. If that makes sense. I'm misquoting that. I'm butchering that quote up. I should get it for the next live stream, but it's basically saying that the puppeticians, the ones whose names we know, they don't have any power. They're just put in front of us to argue over, to fight over, to cheer, to boo, to hiss. That's why they exist. That's their role. Because if you listen to them, they don't have anything cogent, intelligent, incisive, applicable, useful. I already said intelligent to say. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. Nearly 3 hours in to my first live stream in a few months, but their words are empty because it's scripted rhetoric that is designed to sound like something important is being said when it's not. So I would recommend Traitors by Don Watterson. And I will be going over to Huddersfield shortly after this broadcast to spend time with Sheep Farm and Mark Devlin and John Hamer, who are doing a live event today. So I'm looking forward to that very much. And it's going to be a good day out. David Stevenson says, Conclusions and Recommendations is available on WeLib. Free downloads, complete book. Nice. Good to know. I'm going to get that. I think it'd be worth having an electronic copy. I'd rather have a physical copy, but when that's not possible, I will go for the electronic copy. That's good. Thank you for that reminder, David. I appreciate it. So I'm going to wrap up this broadcast now. allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews. If you want to get in touch, find ways to support, follow me on the various places where I am. Mainly it's Telegram, though. I don't do a lot on the other stuff, on Instagram and Twixter, but I have accounts there just in case I ever need them. But Telegram's where I'm most active. Of course, you can also sign up for Continuity of Control, the short free email series. It's kind of a mini course on crazy quotations from the elite delivered to your inbox covering the last 70 years. And you can get my ultimate reading list as well at ultimatereadinglist.com. It's a full inventory, over 800 books grouped together by theme and topic, books that I personally have in my library that I think are important and worth preserving. Or you can send me an email at nick@hayesreviews.com. I would like to hear from you. It would be good to get in touch with other people who are interested in these topics and these types of discussions. So I'm going to leave it there. I will hopefully be back soon with the next chapter of Foundations, Their Power and Influence. Wonderful book. Very critical piece of the puzzle in helping us understand how the world really works. I'm sure you will agree. But I hope you all have a lovely weekend. It's Saturday morning. It's looking reasonably dry outside, which is good. And whatever you get up to this weekend, I hope it is fulfilling. I hope it is enriching to your quality of life. I hope it is creative and not screen-based. Spend time with the people in 3D world who are near and dear to your heart, and tell them you appreciate them. And, let's be kind to each other. And as JJ Cooey often reminds us as well, let's love our neighbor. It's a good message to put out there. It's a good way to end a stream, I think. So take it easy, everyone. Thanks for joining me on the live and on the replay. allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews. If you want to support in any way, I would be most appreciative and grateful. And that's all I got to say for now. God bless.